seller 1 to seller 4. So seller 1 is paying to do a closing purchase while seller 4 is receiving a premium for doing an opening sale and then joining the game as a seller at that point. So notice again, seller 1 is out of the game, seller 4 has substituted. And we still have equal numbers of buyers and sellers, which we always must have in these types of option transactions. So by closing out the sellers, the writers are relieved by their obligation, and the owners of the obligation have to give up their right if they leave the game as well. You have to make sure, though, that in order to close out your position, you do exactly the opposite transaction from your initial move in the game. So we should take a look at some examples to be sure that we're able to pick out the right closing transaction. The investor buys 1 ABC May 140 call at 4. To close out this position, what would this investor do? Well, first we need to think. What do they do to begin with? Well, in this case, they were buying a call. So to close out that transaction, remember that they would do the opposite transaction on the same type of option. So in this particular situation, the proper closing transaction would be B, to sell exactly the same call. So notice in this situation, the buy choices are eliminated because you have to sell to close when you buy to open. Whereas in this particular case, we would also eliminate this one because this is for a put option. If you were to close out a call option by selling it, it has to be related to the call option that you bought in the first place. You can't close out a call option by selling a put option. Let's look at one more example. In this particular example, our investor sold 2 XYZ March 40 puts for 6 points each. How could this position be liquidated? Now, think about what that would mean. What is your opening transaction, and then what would the corresponding closing transaction be? In order to liquidate this original position, this investor would do D, buy 2 XYZ March 40 puts. Notice we can eliminate, for example, this one, C, because it's the wrong stock, of course, and since we sold 2 puts to begin with, we have to close 2 puts out in order to cancel our position. And of course, if you start by selling, then you close by buying, so that eliminates this one, B. So D must be the correct answer in this particular case. Now that we've seen how closing out can help a seller because it cancels out their obligation, they were afraid that their losses might keep mounting up, and so by closing out, they have no further obligation. They might have had a loss to do the closeout, but at least their loss is limited and set at a certain amount. What about buyers? Well, buyers often want to close out as well, and why would you want to do that if you were a buyer? If things are going well, if the stocks are going up and it might be profitable for you to exercise, what's in it for the buyer in terms of closing out an option or liquidating a position? So let's take an example. Suppose that the market value of ABC stock is $104 per share. An investor buys a January 100 call at that time for $700. Now, note the investor's break-even point for this is 107, strike price plus premium. Now, suppose that the stock does rise to 128. And notice that's certainly above the break-even, and so this should be a profitable situation for the buyer of this call. How could the buyer of this call take advantage of this situation? Now, we could, of course, exercise our option, but we could also see another possibility at this point, is that we could close out the option by selling an ABC January 100 call for a certain premium. The question, though, is how much would the owner of the call receive for selling the call to close out the position? The investor would receive the current premium of that option. Now, what the option is selling for at that time, at the time of the closeout occurs, and as in any situation, we can figure that out, the option premium should be by thinking what the intrinsic value and time value should be for a premium at that particular point in time. So first, we're going to determine the intrinsic value, as we usually do, and then think about the time value of the option. So the strike price of the option, notice in the example that we're looking at was 100 per share. The market value of the option at the time we close out is 128. So at the time we close out this premium that we're trying to determine should have intrinsic value of 28 points, since the option is 28 points in the money. So the premium will at least be that large, but we assume that the option is not real close to expiration. Then there will be some time value included in the premium as well. Now, we don't know exactly what it's going to be, but what we're going to do here is to guess or estimate how much time value should be included. So we're going to guess maybe 2 points of time value included and include that in our calculation. So with 28 points of intrinsic value plus another 2 points of time value, that would give us a total premium at that point of 30. So we would be assuming that we are closing out our position at 30 points in this particular point in time. So the question is, if we could either exercise this option when the stock is at 128 or choose this and sell at 30 as a final premium, which one should we do? We have a choice between the two. Now, if we exercise, we will certainly earn a profit. For example, we could exercise at 100 and buy stock for $10,000 on 100 shares, and then we immediately turn around and sell the stock at the current market value of 128. So our total cost was the premium plus the strike price for the call option. Our total proceeds are $12,800. The market value, so we make $2,100 if we exercise the option. Now, another choice to remember is to close out the option. What happens there? We'll buy the option for $700. So how much can we resell it for at that time? We'll assume that the premium was $30. So the option now is worth $3,000, which is what we could sell it for at that particular moment. So not only would we have a profit, but also notice that the profit here would be larger than if we had exercised the option, $2,300 in this particular case. Now, some of the problems on the exam are going to require you to think about what happens when an investor closes out a position. So we should look at some practice examples that take this into account. So let's look at some examples. Now, what they're looking here at is an investor who is selling the call. The company announces improved financial results, and that, as usual, means the stock goes up. So when the stock reaches 40, the investor repurchases the call for $700. What's the profit or loss? Now, again, the key words here are profit or loss. Now, that indicates that we should use a T-chart to solve the problem. First, the investor sells the option, and that means, of course, that they're going to receive the premium of $300. If you sell an option, you receive a premium. And, of course, we remind ourselves that that was for selling a 35 call. Next, though, the investor does a closing purchase for $700. Notice that if you do an opening sale and receive money, you do a closing purchase to close out or cancel your position. But we had to pay $700 to do that. Now, notice that all the other information in the problem is extraneous. You opened a position by selling, you close a position by buying back. Your position is gone and you're all ready to calculate your gain or loss. So the net result is a $400 loss in this situation. Now, in some of these problems, the information is going to be given to you indirectly. You may have to dig it out. So, for example, we have in this case an investor who buys a put for $600. Later, the stock rises, and just before expiration, the investor liquidates it and closes out their position at intrinsic value. What is the gain or loss? Again, we start by pulling up the T-chart because it's a gain or loss problem. Now notice, what did the investor start by doing? Well, they started by buying a